Look at this question 26 in 2012 MCQ paper. The question says, the diagram below shows different equilibrium income levels for an economy under different aggregate demand conditions, right? So on this side, you get the different income levels. And then here they have drawn two different curves to represent different aggregate demand conditions. And this one is the consumption function. The one at the bottom is the consumption function, and this is the aggregate demand curve 1, and this is the aggregate demand curve 2, right? And on this side of the diagram, we get the aggregate expenditure as usual, and here we have the aggregate income, if not the real GDP. All right, so by giving all this information, what do they ask us to recognize? If the full employment level of income is YF, which distance measures the inflationary gap? All right, the question is about the inflationary gap, and you need to recognize the gap, if not the region of this diagram, which represents this inflationary gap. So before we look at all the given options, we will quickly go through the note and then let's come back to the given options. So this is about the inflationary gap, and I'm telling you, when the current aggregate demand exceeds the aggregate demand needed to achieve full employment level of income, it creates an inflationary gap, which means simply when the current level of aggregate demand exceeds the aggregate demand needed to achieve this full employment level of income, it creates the inflationary gap. Right. So let me ask this question now. Looking at all these information, looking at this entire diagram, you just try to recognize the aggregate demand needed to achieve this full employment level of aggregate income. So the question itself tells us that this YF represents the full employment level of national income. If so, the full employment level of national income is achieved when this becomes the 45-degree line. This is a line where we say that the aggregate income in the economy is equal to the aggregate expenditure. And then when Y becomes equal to the aggregate expenditure, if not aggregate demand, so that is the relevant, this is the relevant demand curve, and this is the Y equals E curve. And on this side, we say the aggregate demand curve, if not the aggregate expenditure. So at this point, what happens? The economy achieves this full employment level of national income, and that is given to us as YF. Then what are a note? In the note, we say when the current aggregate demand exceeds the aggregate demand needed to achieve the full employment level of national income, we see this inflationary gap. So see, we don't need to consider this one. The reason it's about the consumption function, but when we recognize this inflationary gap, we need to focus on the aggregate demand that exceeds the demand needed to achieve the full employment level of national income. So here that happens. If you just go along this curve, right, there the aggregate demand exceeds the aggregate demand needed to achieve this full employment level of national income. So this gap between the two curves, right, this gap between the two curves, this gap, if not this gap, represent that inflationary gap. Then what ඔක තව ටිකක් හොඳට කියනවා නම් මෙහෙම හොඳට අහගෙන ඉන්න මේක. මොකද්ද? This gap is anyway equal to, see, this gap is anyway equal to this gap, because this is parallel. These two, the lines, the curves are parallel to each other. If not, those are equal to this gap, the gap between these 2 points. එනිසා මම දැන් ඔයාලට කියනවා, if you need to recognize the inflationary gap, yes, you can do it. You can recognize that inflationary gap using this x-axis or maybe using the y-axis. මේ දෙකම gap එක එකයි. හේතුව තමයි if this is a 45-degree line, the scale of this x-axis has to be same as the scale of the y-axis, so that using any of these axes you can recognize the inflationary gap. එහෙනම් ඒකේ ආන්සර් එක තමයි මොකද්ද? y22 yf is the inflationary gap. If not, this is the inflationary gap. If not, this is the inflationary gap. If not, this is the inflationary gap. ඒතර මේවා ඒගොල්ලෝ label කරලා නැති නිසා either you can say y2 to ye, that gap is the inflationary gap. If not, r to h is the inflationary gap. If not, even g to k represent the same inflationary gap. So one of this you will find here in the provided answers. So yeah, you have it here, the second one, right? This is given to us in the answer. So for the question number 26, second one is the answer. Right, come to this question number 27. It says, if the reserve requirement is 20%, right? If the reserve requirement, statutory reserve ratio, if it is 20%, SRR is 20%, so which is equal to 0.2 simply. The existence of 100 million worth of excess reserves. Okay, the value of excess reserves is 100 million in the banking system. So this is one point for us. This is the excess reserves in the entire banking system. Okay, so what's the question? If the reserve requirement is 20%, the existence of 100 million worth excess reserves in the banking system can lead to a maximum expansion of money supply equals to which out of these five? Right. So to recognize the money supply, we need to first look at the way that we define this money supply. And I believe that you all remember this, that there are several definitions given for money supply, right? There are several definitions given for money supply, but based on the given data in this question, you can recognize that this question talks about the narrow money supply. So wait, I'll show you the note on narrow money supply, then we can discuss the remaining part of this question. Right, look at this note. It's about the money supply, and we have several definitions, not one, we have several definitions for money supply. So if you look at this part, so we have four definitions, but as I mentioned earlier, what we require for this question is the narrow money supply. So let's look at that definition. So narrow money supply is the total, M1 is the total of currency held by the public and the demand deposits held by the public in commercial banks. So the addition of the currency held by the public and the demand deposits held by the public in commercial banks, we recognize as the narrow money supply. So if you remember that, now come to the question once again. So we can write, right? We can write. So this is about the money supply, the first definition. So currency held by the general public plus demand deposits held by the general public. එහෙනම් මොකද්ද ගානේ අහන්නේ? If the reserve requirement is 20% and the existence of excess reserve is 100 million in the entire banking system, it can lead to a maximum expansion of money supply, the maximum change in money supply. So that's the requirement. That's what we need to calculate. And based on the given data, we can't calculate or we can't even recognize the currency held by the general public. So we can only work with these demand deposits held by the general public in commercial banks. So to calculate this is simply the total deposits, right? This is simply the total deposits held by the general public in commercial banks, right? So to calculate this total deposits in commercial banks, I hope that you all remember that we can use this deposit multiplier. So this is what we can write here. We can write deposit multiplier times the excess reserve. Because using this excess reserve, you can offer loans, we can create credit. So excess reserve times the deposit multiplier will be the total deposit that will be created in the entire banking system as a result of having this 100 million excess reserve. So to calculate the deposit multiplier K, you use this equation. Let's say K equals 1 over SRR. So 1 over 0.2, and that will give us 5. So deposit multiplier is 5, and the excess reserve, the reserve that they can use to offer loans or create credit, is just 100. So as a result of having this 100 million worth excess reserve, they can create a total deposit of 500 million in the entire banking system. So when this get increased by 500 million, even the narrow money supply increases by same 500 million. So that's the answer, right? That's the answer. So it is the fourth option. For question 27, fourth one is the answer. So no point of discussing these other options, because mathematically, if this is what we get, that's the answer. That's it. So 28 question. In 28 question, we get this: if the public's desire to hold money as currency increases. Okay, see what happens. From the previous question, they just talk about the money supply, but here in this question 28, now they talk about the uh, desire of the general public to keep money as currency. What is that? That's about the money demand. So if I show you the note related to that, look at this one, the definition given for money demand. See, money demand, if not liquidity preference, is the desire of the general public to keep cash in the form of currency notes and coins at a given time. So they talk about that in this question. All right, so let's read. If the public's desire to hold money as currency increases, what will be the impact on the banking system? All right, so this is what we can discuss using the given information in this question. So money demand increases, which means people do not put money in bank accounts. They just keep money in the form of notes and coins. So let me write it here. They prefer to keep money in the form of notes and coins. In the form of notes and coins. So what happens next? When that money demand increases, when people prefer to keep money in the form of notes and coins, not as bank deposits, what happens? The available deposits, if not the available cash reserves. So let me write available deposits. Wait. What happens next? The deposits, if not the cash reserves, right? Both deposits and cash reserves. What will happen to the deposits and cash reserves in the commercial banks? In commercial banks, what happens to this? This decreases. Right? Again, then commercial banks වල තියෙන cash reserves අඩුයි, ඒගොල්ලන්ට තියෙන money අඩුයි, ඒගොල්ලන්ගේ deposits අඩුයි. ඕක තමයි කතන්දරේ. එහෙනම් ඒගොල්ලන්ට තියෙන cash අඩු වුණාම ඊට පස්සේ ඒගොල්ලන්ට තියෙන deposits අඩු වුණාම මොකද වෙන්නේ? As we discussed previously, මොකද වෙන්නේ? Let's say cash balances drops, even the ability to create credit decreases. And not only that, they can't even invest in other assets such as treasury bills, treasury bonds. No, they can't invest in those assets. The reason, they don't have enough money to invest in those assets. So they can't buy treasury bills. The investment decreases. So these are the things that will happen. And ultimately, what happens to the economy, even the money supply of the economy will decrease. So these are the things that will happen as a result of increase in the money demand. Right now, if you have this with you, if you have this knowledge with you, so you can select the correct answer from the given options. Right, let's read the first one. Banks would be more able to increase their liquid assets. I hope that you all remember that in the balance sheet of the commercial banks, we divide assets into two. On one side, we have reserve assets, and on the other side, we have the earning assets. එතකොට මේ reserve assets ඇතුලේ තියෙන cash වලට අපි කියනවා liquid assets කියලා. Cash reserves we recognize as liquid assets. එතකොට මොකද වෙන්නේ when money demand increases, cash amount, the available cash decreases. If so, this is wrong. Right? If so, this is wrong because it says the opposite. Banks would be more able to increase their liquid assets. No, that will really decrease. The second one, banks would be more able to increase their earning assets. So under earning assets, you have different types of assets, even the loans and advances, the investments that you do in treasury bills, treasury bonds, all of these are included in earning assets. But what happens when money demand increases? When money demand increases, your ability to invest in treasury bills, your ability to create loans, that drops. So that this is also wrong. Banks would be less able to increase their earning assets. So that's the true statement, but this says the opposite. So this is also not the answer. The third one, banks would be less able to reduce interest rates they charge. So now they are just going to compare the money demand, the relationship that exists between money demand and the interest rates. So there's no such relationship between these two variables. On one side, we can't just consider money demand and we can't comment on what happens to the interest rates because there's no such direct relationship between these two. So this is not exact thing. Again, we can't just directly say that the interest rates reduce or it increases. We can't say that. The fourth one, banks would be more able to expand credit. Would be more able to expand credit. But look at this one. When money demand increases, their ability to create credit decreases. So the opposite of this is true, right? The opposite of the fourth one is true. And the fifth one, banks would be less able to expand credit, and that's the opposite of the fourth one. So this is the true statement. So for this question number 28, fifth one is the answer. Right, now look at this question number 29. Right, question number 29. It says, suppose the amount of reserves in commercial banking system equals 100 million. So this is the total reserves. We don't know whether this is excess reserves or statutory reserve, but this is the total amount given for the reserves. So let me write here, reserves 100 billion, right? 100 billion. And the amount of deposits equal to 800 billion, total deposits in the entire banking system, total deposits equals to 800 billion, right? 800 billion. And the amount of currency held by the public equals 200 billion. Okay. Currency held by the public, see, that is 200 billion. And by giving all these data, what do they ask us to find? Under these circumstances, the money multiplier would equal to which one of the following? Hold on. So that's the question. If so, let me ask this question. What's the equation of calculating this money multiplier? What's the equation of calculating this money multiplier? So money multiplier is the ratio between the money supply and the high powered money. So you can simply write the equation this way. So you can write money multiplier equals money supply divided by high powered money. So this ratio we recognize as the money multiplier. All right. So there are two things that you need to understand. You need to first understand the way that you calculate the money supply, right? You need to understand the way that you calculate the money supply. And on the other side, you need to understand the way that you calculate this high powered money. So if you know how to get the values of these two, you can calculate the money multiplier. Simple as that. So the first question is how to find the money supply. So once again, as I showed you in the previous question, when it comes to the money supply, we have several definitions, but for the time being, based on the data we get here in this question, we can again understand that they are just referring to this narrow money supply, not to any other money supply definitions. If so, you know how to calculate the money supply because we discussed that earlier. M1 money supply is equal to currency held by the general public plus the demand deposits held by the general public in commercial banks. So if I assign values into these components, CP is given to us as 200 and even the DDP, the total deposits is 800. So that for the money supply, we get 1000, right? For the money supply, we get 1000, right? Now, the next thing is to understand how to calculate this high powered money. So let me show you. See, I earlier showed you the components in narrow money supply. So once you recognize the components, you can just add them and get the narrow money supply, the total value. So in the same way, we will try to recognize the components that we find inside this high powered money. So let me show you the note related to that. Right, look at this one. It's about high powered money. If not, it's about monetary based reserve money. Either way, you can just recognize that, no problem. So look at the components of high powered money. We have four components. The first one, currency held by the general public. Second one, currency held by the commercial banks, the cash reserves held by the commercial banks, deposits held by the commercial banks in the central bank. The fourth one, deposits held by the government institutions in the central bank. So if you remember the values given to us in that question, you can simply recognize that this currency held by the general public, right? According to that question, is just 200. Currency held by the general public is 200. And then the total reserves of the commercial banks, if not the currency held by the commercial banks, is given to us as 100 billion. So let's go back to the question and check those values. So see that now, high powered money is equal to the currency held by the general public plus the currency held by the commercial banks, and that is given to us here as reserves. So let me write here reserves, and we have two more components, but the problem, we don't need to focus on those much. The reason in this question we don't have values for those other two components, so let's assume that to be 0. So now let me put values for each component. CP, the currency held by the general public, is just 200 billion and the currency held by the commercial banks is just 100 billion. So the other two are assumed to be 0, so that the high powered money, the total amount is just 300. So as I explained earlier, if you get the ratio between money supply and the high powered money, you can calculate the money supply. If so, just get the ratio between this 1000 and then this 3000. So 1000 divided by 3000 is simply 3.3. 33, and that's the amount of money multiplier in this given economy. Right. So you have it here as the fifth option. So for this question number 29, fifth one is the answer. Right. Now the 30th question. An open market purchase of government securities by the central bank. So we discussed this in 2011 MCQ paper as well. So this is with regard to this reverse repo market where the central bank buys, right? Where the central bank buys the treasury bills and the treasury bonds from the commercial banks. So that is the trade that happens here. So when that happens, what happens to the reserves of a commercial bank? What happens to the cash balances of a commercial bank? See, the commercial bank in this situation, what happens? The commercial bank sells treasury bills or maybe treasury bonds to the central bank. Commercial banks sell these treasury bills and treasury bonds to the central bank, and in return, the commercial banks receive money. So their cash balances get increased. They receive cash. So that their reserves will increase. As a result, their reserves will increase. So what happens when their reserves get increased? Right? When their reserves get increased, the bank's ability to create credit, the bank's ability to create credit increases, and that finally increases the money supply in the economy. ඔය ටික තමයි වෙන්නේ. හරි. දැන් අපි බලමු එහෙනම් කියවලා. An open market purchase of government securities by the central bank will increase bank reserves. Yes, true. It will increase bank reserves. And thus increase the monetary base. ඔයාට මේ විනාඩි 5කට කලින් තමයි මම මේ වචනේ පෙන්නුවේ. මොකද්ද monetary base කියලා කියන්නේ? Monetary base refers to the amount of high powered money. එතකොට as we discussed in the previous question, I think I have it here. Yes. As we discussed in the previous question, when banks reserves get increased, even the amount of high powered money increases. එහෙනම් මොකද වෙන්නේ? මම මෙතනදී ඔයාලා කිව්වා when the commercial bank sells to the central bank, when the commercial bank sells their treasury bills and treasury bonds to the central bank, what happens to the reserves of the commercial bank? It increases. And when reserves go up, right? When reserves go up, even the amount of high-powered money go up. The reason, this is just one component that we find inside the high-powered money. So even the monetary base, if not the high-powered money, even that goes up. So this has to be the answer for question number 30. But we will go through the other options as well. The second one, an open market purchase of government securities by the central bank will decrease the bank reserves and thus decrease the monetary base. So it's simply the opposite, right? No need to read this. Increase bank reserves, okay, it is true. Decrease the monetary base. Now I explained how the increased reserves increases the monetary base. I explained that. Even the fourth one says that the bank reserves get decreased. No, initially this part is wrong. Even this says the same, so no need of reading that. All right, so the answer for this question number 30 is the third one. All right, now come to this question 31. In question 31, they say, which one of the following is a reason for government intervention to correct a market failure? Simply, they just ask you to recognize the reasons for government intervention to the market economy. Now, what is the reason? Is it because in the market economy we have inferior goods? No, not in the market economy. In any type of economy, we will have inferior goods. එතකොට inferior good එකක්ද නැද්ද කියන එක decide වෙන්නේ government එක label කරන නිසාවත් නැතුව මේ business firm එක ඒක හදන business firm එකේ nature එක දිහාවත් බලලා නෙමෙයි we decide whether this good is inferior or not. ඒක decide වෙන්නේ it is decided simply based on the consumers respond when their income increases. Again, if the consumer's income increases, if they decrease the demand for a given good, then that is an inferior good. That is not a market failure, right? That's not a market failure. And having diseconomies of scale in production is not a market failure. So if it's not a market failure, then there's no requirement for this government to intervene into that market simply based on having diseconomies of scale in the economy. No. The third one, look at the third one. Externalities in production and consumption. See, that is a problem in the market economy. What is the problem? We say this market economy only focuses on the private costs and the private benefits. And they ignore the social costs and the social benefits, the external cost and the external cost and the benefits. They ignore it. As a result of ignoring these externalities, maybe in production or maybe in consumption, right? As a result of ignoring these externalities, what happens? There will be underproduction or under allocation of resources, or maybe over allocation of resources into different goods. So if I tell you that precisely, as a result of ignoring, right? As a result of ignoring positive externalities in consumption, there will be under allocation. There will be under allocation of resources to produce merit goods. And at the same time, as a result of ignoring negative externalities in consumption, there will be over allocation of resources to produce demerit goods. See, this is a problem. Now, the government recognizes this as a market failure. So the market fails to recognize the external benefits and the external cost of these goods, so that they try to, the government tries to provide more and more merit goods while trying to decrease, control the consumption and the production of these demerit goods. So that's what the government does, right? And answer එක වෙන්නේ මොකද්ද? This is a real problem we have in a market economy, and for that reason, since this is a market failure, the government intervenes to the market to correct those market failures. So the answer for this question 31 is 3. එතකොට අනිත් ඒවා ඔයාලා කියවම තේරෙනවා ඒ කියන්නේ ඒවා කිසිම meaning එකක් නැහැ, මේකට related නැහැ ඒ දේවල්. So having homogeneous products, එතකොට products homogeneous වෙනකොට government එකකින් මේ government එක ඇවිල්ලා ඒගොල්ලෝ කියනවා no you can't do that, එහෙම මුකුත් වෙන්නේ නැහැ in a market economy. ඒක ප්‍රශ්නයක්වත් නෙමෙයි having homogeneous products. Having advertising is not a problem, is not a failure in the market economy. These are not related, then the answer is the third one. Right. This question 32. The table below indicates the private and external costs and the benefits. We discussed that resulting from building a coal burning power station. All right. So we have discussed similar examples in our note as well. So let me just show you the note. Right, look at this one. This is about the costs and benefits in a market economy. So we have private cost, right? We have private cost. So that is the cost borne by the party directly engaged in the specific production or maybe consumption activity. Then we have the external cost. And then we get the social cost. How do I define this social cost? So I define that as the total of private cost and the external cost. So the total of these two is equal to social cost. In the same way, the total of private benefit and external benefit is equal to social benefit, right? You have that note here. Right. If so, what's the requirement of this question? That is to calculate the social cost minus the social benefit. Very, very easy. There's nothing to discuss even. But let me quickly show you how to calculate the difference between social cost and the social benefit. So as I showed you in the note, social cost comes as these two, as the addition of these two components. So we have the private cost plus the external cost, and that is equal to the social cost. And to calculate the social benefit, we just take the total of private benefit and the external benefit. So private cost is given to us as 190 and the external cost is given to us as 140 minus the private benefit is 180 plus the external benefit 110. So 230, 330, and from here we get 190, 290. So 290. So 330 minus 290 is equal to 40. So the answer is 40 billion. Question 32, third one is the answer. All right, now we will move to this question number 33. One reason why free market fails to achieve an optimal allocation of scarce resources is because. ඉතින් අර කලින් කතාවම තමයි. හරිද? කලින් කතාවම තමයි එකම දේ ආයමත් චෙක් වෙන දෙයක් මෙතන වෙන්නේ. So what's the reason? Public goods are provided free of charge to users. So it's true, public goods are provided free of charge to the users. It's true. But this is not the reason why free market fails to allocate an optimal allocation of scarce resources. What is the reason? As we discussed here in this question 31, the reason is having externalities. So that's the real reason. එහෙනම් ඊතර question 31 වල එකයි 32 වල එකයි තව එකක් වෙන්නේ නැහැ. එහෙම දෙකක් වෙන්නේ නැහැ. එහෙනම් අපි ඒක බලමු. Second one says positive externalities lead to overproduction of some goods. See, that's what we discussed earlier. Having positive externalities. මේ තියෙන positive externalities වල කතාව, මේ තියෙන negative. ඒතර if you have positive externalities in consumption, there will be under allocation of resources so that the government will have to provide those merit goods. ඒකයි අපි කතා කළේ. But here you see the opposite. මෙතන කියන්නේ මොකද්ද? Positive externalities lead to overproduction of some goods. No, it leads to underproduction of some goods. So this opposite of this one is true. So there is underproduction of goods with positive RC. That is the answer. That's what we discussed. But anyway, let's go through the other two as well. Individuals' income and wealth are not identical. The wealth not being identical කියන කතාව is not a reason for the market failure. දැන් මේ දේවල් වැරදිට තේරුම් ගන්න එපා. මෙතන කියන්නේ එක පැත්තක තියෙනවා individuals income, අනිත් පැත්තේ තියෙනවා wealth. So since this income and the wealth are not identical, මෙතන මේ කතා කරන්නේ it's not about the disparity in the income distribution. එහෙම කතාවක් නෙමෙයි කියන්නේ. They just say that these two are not identical. These two are unequal. ඒ නිසා the market fails. No, එහෙම සීන් එකක් අපි කොහෙවත් කතා කරලත් නැත්තර. Existence of competition. No, existence of competition is somewhat actually good. That is not a reason for the market failure. So for this question 33, third one is the answer. Right, now look at this question 34. The diagram below shows the market demand and supply curves of a merit good. All right. So it's a merit good. So we know that the resource allocation that we have from the market is very low. To increase, see, as a result, the government tries to increase the consumption from OQ1 and let's say OQ1 to OQ2. Okay, this is the current consumption, but the government tries to increase the consumption, the quantity that get exchanged in the market to Q2 level. That's what the government tries to do. The government could, so to achieve this objective, the government could tax the producer. See, it's the total opposite. If they tax the producers, what will happen? The supply curve gets shifted to the left side, right? The supply curve gets shifted to the left side, and as a result, the quantity that get traded in the market will further reduce, not that it will increase. So this is totally wrong, but the opposite of this is true. What's the opposite? Providing subsidies. Now tax opposite to subsidy, so providing subsidies. The next one, subsidize producers by P3, P1 per unit of good. Okay, now the government is trying to provide a subsidy for the producers by this amount, P3 to P1. All right, so yeah, what happens? The amount of unit subsidy is given to you. If that is given to you, now you know the gap between these two is the unit subsidy. එහෙනම් මොකද වෙන්නේ? The supply curve, as I mentioned earlier, this time the supply curve gets shifted to the right side by the amount of unit tax. Right? The supply curve gets shifted to the right side by the amount of unit tax. And the unit tax is the difference between P3 and P1. And if you construct another curve parallel to this supply curve, if you just construct another curve, ඒක කොච්චරක් දුරින්ද තියෙන්නේ parallel curve එක තියෙන්න ඕනේ අර කලින් supply curve එකට මෙන්න මෙච්චරක් දුරින්. P3, P1 දුරකින්. ඒ කියන්නේ at this point, see, now the government can achieve their objective. So if they provide a subsidy for the producers, the supply curve gets shifted to this left side by the amount of this unit subsidy, and as a result, the price reduces and the quantity consumed increases. So that is the answer then, second one. So imposing a maximum price, ඊට පස්සේ imposing a minimum price, අපි නිකන් shape එක කතා කරලා බලමු ඕනේ නම් ඒවත්. Imposing a maximum price කියලා කිව්වට පස්සේ the maximum price will be somewhat lower than the equilibrium price. එතන අපි තුමු මේ වගේ just to discuss this third one, right? Imposing a maximum price. So if this is what they try to do, impose a maximum price of OP3. OP3 කියලා කියන්නේ maximum price එකක් නෙමෙයිනේ. ඒක එතරම් වැරදිනේ. Impose a maximum price මොකද a price higher than the equilibrium price we recognize as a minimum price. ඒතර OP3 කියලා කියන්නේ it's not a maximum price. So එතරම් මේ කතාව වැරදි. Second, the fourth one, impose a minimum price of OP2. If the minimum price of OP2 is not a minimum price, that is equilibrium price. If it, as we discussed earlier, if it's a minimum price, it has to be a price greater than the equilibrium price. So that is also wrong. It has no meaning. Then introduce a guaranteed price of OP1. OP1 වගේ guaranteed prices දෙන්නේ නැහැ. Guaranteed prices කියලා කියන්නේත් මේ minimum price කියන එක තමයි. So it has to be a price higher than that. එතන මේ කියන කිසිම කතාවකට තේරුමක් නැහැ. එහෙනම් the answer is a second one for this question number 34. Right. Now look at this question number 35. If the economy is in severe recession, all right. So the economy is in a severe recession. Which of the following is the fiscal policy most effective in stimulating production? So they just ask us to recognize which one of the following is the fiscal policy most effective in stimulating production. එහෙනම් අපි මෙන්න මෙහෙම ආන්සර් එක අඳුර ගන්න try කරමු. මුලින්ම මම ඔයාලට පෙන්නන්නම් the meaning of fiscal policy. මොකද in our syllabus we mainly discuss about two different policies. On one side we have the fiscal policy and on the other side we have the monetary policy, right? So these are the two policies that we have in the syllabus mainly. Let me show you the meaning of fiscal policy and the meaning of monetary policy. Right, look at this one. It says fiscal policy refers to the economic policy used to manage government revenue and then government expenditure and public debts to achieve following macroeconomic objectives. So simply the fiscal policy is connected to the government revenue, the government expenditure, and the public debts. So if you look at the note related to this monetary policy, we say that the central bank has two main objectives. The primary objective, the other objective is a secondary objective. So this is the primary objective: achieve and maintain an economic and domestic price stability. So if you just look at that, right? If you look at that here, I have explained that maintaining the economic and price stability. And under that, I'm telling you, the central bank uses monetary policy to achieve the economic and domestic price stability in the economy. So let's go back to with that knowledge, let's go back to the theory, the question. The question asks us to recognize a policy related to government revenue, government expenditure, or public debt. Right? The question asks us to recognize a policy related to those which is most effective in stimulating the production just to overcome this severe recession. හරි. එහෙනම් අපි දැන් discuss කරලා බලමු මොකක්ද වෙන්න ඕනේ කියලා. So look at this business cycle first. Right? Look at the business cycle first. So the government is trying to overcome the recession, which means they are here now at this stage of the business cycle. They are in a recession. And what do they need to do? They need to overcome this recession, which means they just need to move to the other side of the business cycle. And this we recognize as an expansion, right? We recognize this as an expansion. So they just need to expand the economy. To overcome the recession, they need to expand the economy. So how do they expand the economy? So if you look at that note, during expansion, what's the most important thing that happens? The aggregate demand increases. That's the very first thing that happens in an economy during expansion, right? The aggregate demand increases. And we know aggregate demand is equal to the aggregate expenditure, and it consists of these components, CIG, and then net exports. So if you can increase one of these components, right? If you can increase one of these components, you can increase the aggregate demand. හැබැයි මේ component ඕන එකක් වැඩි වුණාම ඒක මේ question එකට answer එක වෙනවද කියන එක මම එහෙම එකක් නෙමෙයි කිව්වේ. මේ ඕන එකක් වැඩි වුණාම in general the aggregate demand increases. හැබැයි මේ question එක අපි මොකද්ද කරන්න ඕනේ? You need to recognize the fiscal policy most effective in stimulating production. එතකොට මේවා වැඩි වෙන්නත් ඕනේ, ඒ නිසා aggregate demand එක වැඩි වෙන්නත් ඕනේ. And on the other side, it has to be a policy related to government expenditure, government income, or maybe public debts. ඔය ටික ඔක්කොම වෙන්න ඕනේ. හරි. එහෙනම් අපි දැන් බලමු the first one. Government spending increases. All right. So the government spending increases means in this equation, we have recognized this third component to be the government purchases. So this is going to increase. And when this get increased, the aggregate demand increases. And when aggregate demand increases, the production increases. When production increases, the level of employment increases. When the level of employment increases, the level of income increases. So that the economy get expanded. එනවා වැඩේ හරි. ඒක තමයි උත්තරේ. But we will go through the other options as well. The second one, government spending decreases. So it will worsen the recession, right? It will worsen the recession. මොකද හේතුව දැන් මේ ඔක්කොම වැඩ කරන්නේ අනිත් පැත්තට. So government spending reduces so that the aggregate demand further reduces. එහෙනම් the recession will continue. So that is what will happen. The third one, personal income taxes are increased. See, when the personal income taxes are increased, මොකද වෙන්නේ? The consumption decreases. When consumption decreases, the aggregate demand also decreases, and it will once again worsen the recession. එකක්වත් answer එකක් වෙන්නේ නැහැ. Right. The fourth one, the central bank sells securities on the open market. Okay, let me discuss that in this way. The central bank sells securities on the open market means this is something that we discussed earlier uh, as well in this paper. Mokadda, the treasury bills and the treasury bonds are sold to the central bank by the commercial banks, and in return, these commercial banks will receive cash. Commercial banks receives cash. So their cash reserves will go up. When the cash reserves, so see that now, this is the first thing that happens. Commercial banks will receive cash. So as a result, their reserves will increase. When their reserves get increased, listen to this carefully. When their reserves get increased, their ability to create credit increases. Their ability to create credit increases, and then the money supply in the economy increases. And when the money supply increases, the people have a higher purchasing power, so that they will increase the aggregate demand, and then all the other things will happen. When the aggregate demand increases, the production will increase. When the production get increased, the level of employment will increase, and when the level of employment increases, the level of income increases. So it what see, even that is a possible answer for this question number 4. You might think so, but still, this is not a possible answer. This whole thing comes under the monetary policy, not under the fiscal policy. If it's something related to the fiscal policy, it has to be something related to the government revenue, government expenditure, or maybe government debt, if not public debt. And that's why we do not select this fourth one as the answer for this question, right? So the answer is the first one. The fifth one, the central bank buys securities on the open market, then the opposite of this will occur in the economy. All right, so that's about this question number 35. Now we will move to question number 36. The table below indicates the number of labor hours required in countries X and Y to produce 1 unit of food or 1 unit of clothing. දැන් ඔයාලා මේ එක එක ගණන් බලලා වැඩ පටලවා ගන්න එපා. So let me show you another question we had in 2011 paper. And you just try to tell me, the difference between this table we have here in this question 38 in 2011 paper and the table that you have in 2012 paper. What's the difference? Look at the main part of this question. This is 2011 MCQ, right? 2011 MCQ. It says the diagram shows the amount of rice and clothing that can be produced in countries X and Y with a given quantity of resources. Which means simply, what do you see here in this diagram, or what do you see here in this table? You see the possible production of clothing and rice from 1 unit of resource. The production values, the values related to the output, are given in this table. But if you go back to this question 36 in paper 2012, what do you see there? Indicates the number of labor hours required in countries X and Y to produce 1 unit of food or 1 unit of clothing. inside this table you get the inputs, but inside that previous table you found the outputs. නිසා මේ දෙක කියනක ඔයාලට දැන් ඇත්තටම තේරෙන්නත් ඕනි සහ ඒකට රිලේටඩ් තියරි එක ඔයාලට තේරෙන්නත් ඕනි. මොකද we have discussed everything. එහෙනම් මොකද්ද මේකට රිලේටඩ් තියරි එක? Let me show you that. Right, look at this. So the question is, why do countries engage in international trade? So the countries may engage in international trade due to having absolute advantage or maybe due to having comparative advantage. Right? So that's the simplest answer. And then if you look at this absolute advantage, I'm telling you, a country has absolute advantage in producing goods when that country can produce more from a particular product using the same amount of resources. If not, when that given country can produce the same quantity using a lower resources compared to another country. එහෙනම් දැන් ඇත්තටම ඔයාලා දැක්කොත් එහෙම තේරෙයි මේ දෙකේ අර questions දෙකේ වෙනස තමයි තියෙන්නේ. 2012 වල තිබුණේ output values. In 2012 question again, if you try to recognize the absolute advantage, you just need to do it under this sentence given here. Right? And in 2012 paper, if you need to recognize the absolute advantage, you need to recognize it based on this sentence given here. You need to recognize the country that can produce the same quantity using a lower amount of resources compared to another country. ඔක තමයි. ඒතොර ඒ දෙකේ වෙනස මෙන්න මෙහෙම මම කියලා තියෙනවා. මොකද්ද? Identifying absolute advantage, you can identify this absolute advantage maybe based on output approach or maybe based on input approach. So the question you find in 2011 MCQ paper is related to the output approach, but this question is related to the 2012 question is related to the input approach. එතකොට මේ දෙකේ අඳුර ගන්න විදිය චුට්ටක් වෙනස්. Even if you go to the not related to the comparative advantage, it's the same thing. So the principle of comparative advantage, ඔතන කතාව කියලා, so I'm not going to read that, but I'm just trying to show you that even under comparative advantage, we have the same two approaches to recognize, right? To recognize it. So when you calculate comparative advantage, you have two approaches. The first one is the output approach. The other one is the input approach. So once again, this 2011 MCQ 38 is related to this output approach, and 2012 question 36 is related to the input approach. So when you calculate this opportunity cost under output approach and then again under input approach, you use two different equations. Then if I explain that here, if you need to calculate the opportunity cost of good X under the output approach, what's the equation you apply? You apply delta Y divided by delta X. Right? That's the equation related to the output approach. That's how you calculate this opportunity cost under output approach. But if you try to calculate this opportunity cost under input approach, then the opportunity cost of good X is equal to the delta X value divided by delta Y value. මෙතන X and Y කියලා මේ කියන්නේ the inputs used to produce good X and the inputs used to produce good Y. ඒතර ඔය දෙක ඔළුවේ තියාගෙන ඔයා මේ question එක කියවන්න ඕනේ. ඒ නිසා 2011 වල කලේ කොහොමද? ඒ විදිහටම මේකේ කළාම මේකේ උත්තරේ එනවා කියලා එකක් නැහැ. එහෙම එකක් නැහැ කොහෙවත්. Right. So to recognize, I don't know whether we need to by looking at the options, we can understand that they talk about the comparative advantage, only about the comparative advantage. But let me show you both the absolute advantage, and the comparative advantage, both. So we have food, and then we have clothing. Then on this side, we have this country X and the country Y. So these are the inputs values. So if you remember that note, how do we recognize a country with the absolute advantage? By recognizing the country which uses least amount of inputs to produce that output. To produce food, the country X uses 20 labor hours, but to produce the same output food, the country Y uses only 10 hours of labor. So their productivity is very high, so that this is the country which has absolute advantage for producing food. Right? Country Y has the absolute advantage in producing food. All right, now let's try to recognize the country with the absolute advantage for producing clothing. So the country X uses 50 hours of labor to produce 1 unit of cloth. But again, the country Y uses only 20 hours of labor to produce that same unit of cloth, which means the country Y has both, the absolute advantage in producing food and clothing, right? For both goods, the absolute advantage goes to country Y. Right. Now let me show you how to calculate the comparative advantage. Not that we are calculating the comparative advantage, but we are recognizing the comparative advantage by calculating the opportunity cost. So wait. We'll keep it here and look at this. Now comparative advantage. Right, comparative advantage. Now you once again have the same two types of goods, food and then clothing. We have X, then we have Y. So what's the equation that I gave you to calculate this opportunity cost under input approach? That is delta X over delta Y, and there I told you X refers to the amount of inputs that we need to produce this good X. So if you put the values into this equation, it will be 20 over, see, they are using 20 units of, look at this, they are using 20 units of labor hours to produce food. And then this country X has 50. They can either use 20 hours and produce one food. If not, they can use 50 hours and produce one unit of clothing. What happens here? This 20 must be divided by delta Y. Delta Y in this case is Y is clothing. So delta Y means 50. So from this you get 0.4. And if you get the reciprocal of this thing, you can calculate the opportunity cost of clothing. So that will be 2.5. So come to this country Y. Then වැඩේ පටලවා ගන්න එපා. මෙතන මේ XY කියලා කියන්නේ these are the two countries. අර මගේ equation XY කියලා කියන්නේ those are the two goods. ඒ නිසා වැඩේ පටලවා ගන්න එපා. ඒවා තේරෙනවා කියලා මම හිතනවා. එහෙනම් දැන් ඔයාට වඩා හොඳ රෝග මම ලියලා පෙන්නනොත් එහෙම දැන් delta x කියලා කියන මෙතන food නම් delta food divided by delta clothing. ඕක තමයි equation එක. හරිද? එතන මේකෙන් එන්නේ මොකද? This is the opportunity cost of food. And this is the opportunity cost of food. ඔන්න පටලවා ගන්න එපා. All right, so let's calculate the other one as well. So when it comes to this country Y, they can, if we calculate the opportunity cost of producing food, you take that to the top and divide that by the labor units required to produce clothing. So that will be 0.5. And if you take the reciprocal of that, that will be simply 2. All right, now let's try to recognize the country with comparative advantage for producing each good. Okay, when it comes to food, country X, the opportunity cost of producing food in country X is 0.4, and the opportunity cost of producing food in country Y is 0.5. So the country with the lowest opportunity cost of producing food is this country X. So they have the comparative advantage in producing food. And then country Y, see, When it comes to clothing, the country X, the opportunity cost of country X is 2.5, but the opportunity cost of country Y is just 2. So this country Y has the lowest opportunity cost, if not the competitive advantage of producing clothing. So you have everything that you need so that you can recognize the answer simply. Given this information, which of the following statement is correct? X has comparative advantage in producing both food and clothing. No. See, X has comparative advantage in producing food only, right? You can recognize it using this table. So food only. So it says both. So the statement is wrong. Y has the comparative advantage in producing, again both. No. The country Y has the comparative advantage in producing only clothing. So once again, that is also wrong. X has comparative advantage in food production. Yes, true, right? X has comparative advantage in producing food items. Y has comparative advantage in clothing production. 100% true. And that's what we see here in this table, right? That's what we see. So this is true. Then that's the answer. But we will go through the other options as well. Y has a comparative advantage in food production. No, it's the opposite. Wrong. Neither country has a comparative advantage in producing either. No. You see that by referring the table. You can understand that. Okay. Look at this question number 37 now. Consider the following hypothetical balance of payment data for a country. All right. So BOP values are given to us. The balance of payment on current account. Okay. The current account balance. This we calculated in 2011 paper as well. So current account balance comes as the total of four balances. So the first balance is the balance in trade account plus the balance in services account plus the balance in primary income account, and then finally we add the balance in secondary income account. So primary income account, secondary income account. So when you get the total of these four balances, you get the current account balance. Okay, so if you look at the given data, you can understand exports of goods and imports of goods, tangible goods. So export is 11,000, import is 13,000, so that the balance in the trade account is how much? That is minus 2,000. The reason, the export value, the income you receive from exporting goods is just 11,000, but the expenditure incurred for importing goods is 13,000. So expenditure is greater than the income that you received, so that the value is minus 2,000, and that plus balance in services account. Net services, that is just given to us directly as 200, and the balance in primary account, net income, net primary income වෙන්න ඕනේ එතන mean වෙන්නේ නැත්නම් මේ ගාන හදන්න බෑ. So it has to be 2,000, again minus 2,000 plus the balance in the secondary income account, that is the current transfers, that is again 100 but minus 100. So this is the equation. So we get minus 2,000 plus 200 minus 2,100. So the answer is 3,900, but that value is a deficit, right? Billion. This is in billions, and that a value is minus. So deficit of rupees 3,900 billion. So answer for this question 37 is the second one. Right, now come to this question number 38. All right. So it says a positive balance. Yeah, a positive balance on merchandise trade. Merchandise trade means the trade of tangible goods. What is it once again? A positive balance of merchandise trade. Merchandise trade is equal to the value of the tangible good exports and imports. The final value in this tangible goods exports and imports. Simply කියනවා නම් මේ කතා කරන්නේ මොකක් ගැනද? මේක කතා කරන්නේ if it's with regard to tangible goods, this is simply the balance in trade account. All right, so the balance in trade account, unlike in our previous question, because in the previous question we had a negative value, right? We had a negative value in the trade account, but unlike in that, here we have a positive balance in the trade account. එහෙනම් මොකක්ද කියන්නේ? A positive balance in the trade account in a country's balance of payments necessarily implies which one of the following? All right, the first one, the terms of trade index is higher than the previous year. Okay, the first problem with this statement is how do you make a comparison between current year values and previous year values, and how do you recognize whether this terms of trade has increased or decreased without those values? The question only tells us that in the given year we have a positive balance in the trade account. In the given year you have a positive balance in the trade account. We can't make comparisons with regard to previous year. That is not related. Right? That is not related. If you just look at this thing, the terms of trade, how do we calculate these terms of trade? It is simply the export price index over the import price index multiplied by 100. So simply by having a positive balance in the trade account, we can't even calculate the terms of trade. මොකද අපිට වමනා කරන්නේ trade account එකේ balance එක නෙමෙයි, we need to have the export price index and the import price index. හැබැයි මේ value එක දැන් මේ මෙතන positive balance එක ඉන්නේ කොහමද? මම මේ කියන වචන වල තේරුම වල එකපාරටම ඔලුවට යයිද දන්නේ. හැබැයි මේ positive balance එක එන්නේ මෙන්න මේ දෙකෙන්. මම මේක මෙතනදිත් I showed you, see this now. It's about the export value and import value. It's about the value. ඒ කියන්නේ මම ඒක තව ටිකක් හොඳට කිව්වොත් ඔයාලට මෙන්න මේ වගේ සීන් එකක්. You will have a positive balance in trade account when your export value තවත් ටිකක් හොඳට කිව්වොත් export income, that is the export value, right? Export income is greater when it is greater than your import value, but in this case import expenditure. Once again it's about the value. එතනයි මම මේ value කියන එක මෙච්චර කියවන්නේ. ඒ value කියන එක මෙච්චර කියවන්නේ මෙන්න මේකයි. දැන් ඔයා accounts කරන්න ඕනෙත් නෑ. ඇත්තටම ඔයා සරලව නිකන් කඩේකට ගිහිල්ලා බඩු අරගෙන තියෙනවා නම් you know the difference between price, quantity and sales value. You know the difference between these two, the price, quantity and the sales value. Just imagine that you export as a country, you export so this is the price, this is the quantity. Once again, this is the price and this is the quantity. You export 100 units at price rupees 20. 100 units at a price rupees 20. And then you import 50 units at a price rupees, let's say 10. Then what do you get here? 200 is the price, 100 is the quantity. 10 is the price, 50 is the quantity. So if you multiply the two, 20 and 20 and 100, if you multiply the two, you get 2000, and that's the value. Here, the value is 500. So if you take the values separately, 10 is price, 50 is quantity, 500 is the value. So what happens when you get the difference between these two, 2000 and 500, you will have a positive balance in the trade account. ඔහොම සීන් එකක් කියන්නේ. එතකොට මේ when you calculate these terms of trade, or දන්නවද, you only consider the export price index and the import price index. So price index only or statistics කරනවා නම් මේවා 1000% දාගෙන ඉන්න ඕනේ දේවල්. හැබැයි ඒවා statistics කරන්නේ නැත්නම් ඒත් ප්‍රශ්නයක් නැහැ. මොකද when I say price index, it only evaluates the changes, the percentage change in price, not the quantity. But the export value comes as a combination of price and quantity. ඒ නිසා ඔයාට මේ දීලා තියෙන values වලින් you can't calculate these terms of trade. Alright, so that's not the answer then. Second one, a positive balance implies more goods are being exported than are being imported. More goods, there මේක මාර හොඳට අහගන්න. මේ කතන්දරේ ඒගොල්ලෝ focus කරන්නේ දැන් කලින් කතන්දරේ terms of trade එකක් calculate කළේ based on the price index values. හැබැයි දැන් මෙතන කතාව යන්නේ more goods, the number of goods. ඒකෙන් මේගොල්ලෝ කියන්න try කරනවා they have imported more goods, the quantity, the exported quantity is higher than the imported quantity. Then ඔයා කල්පනා කරනවා simply by looking at my example, you think then this must be true. Because even in this example, we have exported 100, but we have imported just 50, so that we have this favorable balance of 1500. Then what I got true here? This is just the first example. Now think about a different example where you sell only 10 goods. The quantity is just 10, but the price of one is 200. You sell this, you export this to a different country. And when you import again the same thing. You import 50 units at rupees 10. Then this will be once again 2000, and here you have again 500, and the difference is still plus 1500. එතකොටත් we will have a favorable balance, if not a positive balance in the trade account. හැබැයි මොකද උනේ, unlike in the previous case, this time if you just look at the number of goods that we exported, it's very lower compared to the number of goods that we imported. ඒ නිසා ඒක දෙපැත්තම වෙන්න පුළුවන්. ඒ නිසා මේක ආන්සර් එකක් වෙන්නේ නැහැ. Hope you understand. The third one, an improvement has occurred in the balance of current account. See the problem you know. ඒ කියන්නේ මොකද්ද? I explained that. See, we'll take this equation to the other side. I explained that the current account balance you get as the total of these four. Right? So I'm explaining this point 3. So the current account balance you get as a total of these four balances. And simply because you have a favorable balance in this trade account, imagine that this is just plus 1500 like in our previous example. Plus what if the balance in the trade account is minus 2000, and this is minus 2000, and this is once again minus 2000? Then what will happen? Then the overall balance you receive for the current account will be again minus. This is not always again true. Okay, the next one. The value of imports of goods is less than the value of exports of මොනවද කියලා හිතන්න ඕනේ. ඇයි මේ අර කලින් ගානමයි. ඒගොල්ලෝ දැන් කතා කරනවා value of imports of goods is less than the value of imports of. See that now if you look at the previous table, that's what they have written. The value is written. The මේකේ මොකද වෙලා තියෙන්නේ? The මේ ගානේ since the export value is lower than the import value. In so we have a negative balance here. But if the opposite happens, if the export value is greater than the import value, then you will have a positive balance. ඒක තමයි මේ කියන්නේ. So this is the answer then. ඒතර ඒකම තමයි අපිත් මෙතනදී කිව්වේ මොකද්ද? Export income, if not the export value, is 2000, but the import expenditure, if not the import value, is just 500, so that you have a favorable balance. That's it. Right, Enan, what's the answer for this? The fourth one. Right. All right, look at this question number 39. What does it say? If a country, if country A has absolute advantage in producing everything. අද මේ දැන් මෙහෙමනේ මේ ඔයාට ඒ knowledge එක කියන්නේ ඔයාට ඒක තියෙනවනේ මොකද්ද? ඔයාට දැන් theory එකක් බැරි නම් ඔයාට මේ paper එකකින් උත්තර ටික හොයාගෙන මේක කරගන්න පුළුවන්කම තියෙන්න ඕනේ. හැම එකටම එහෙම කරන්න බෑ. හැබැයි කරන්න පුළුවන් හැම එකටම කරන්න ඕන. කොහොමද ඔයාට ඕන ලකුණුනේ? ඉතින් දැන් මේ 38 එකට අපි සිරා support එකක් ගන්න පුළුවන් if you just look at this question number 37. දැන් මේක කියුවම ඔයාට ඇත්තටම ඔලුවට එන්න ඕනේ අර question එක. මොකද්ද අපි කලින් කරපු එක? කලින් කරපු එක. This question 36. Wait, I'll take that table. I don't know whether I have that table. Yeah, I have it. So we don't need, yeah, we need this. Right, now look at this one. This is the same answer the same two tables we developed for this question number 36. එතර මේක කතාව නේද මේ කියන්නේ? මොකක්ද? If country A has absolute advantage in producing everything. See, if you look at this table, the country Y has absolute advantage in producing everything. All right. So I hope that you understand. Then the first one, no trade will take place because country A will have a comparative advantage in everything. Then what I got true the false කියලා මේ table එක බලුවම පේනවා. So it's true that this country Y has absolute advantage in producing everything, but if you look at the second table, you can understand. But when it comes to the comparative advantage, the country Y has the comparative advantage only for producing clothing, not in everything. And so this is wrong. අනිත තමයි මේක නිසාම නෙමෙයි මේක wrong කියලා කියන්නේ. මේක කියනවා no trade will take place කියලා. No, simply because one country gaining the absolute advantage in everything doesn't mean that the country cannot take part in international trade. Like in this example, yes, in terms of absolute advantage, they can't engage in trade. But the most important one is the comparative advantage. So forget about the absolute advantage and looking at the opportunity costs of producing the goods in each country, you can engage in international trade. So based on comparative advantage, you can engage in international trade. Insa no trade will take place කියලා කියනවා නම් එතන මානසික වැරදි. Right? ඊළඟට the third one, trade will probably take, see that now the wordings, trade will probably, of course, though they have absolute advantage in producing everything, they might not have the comparative advantage in producing everything. If so, the international trade may take place and all countries will gain. Yes, they will have two main advantages. මොකද්ද පළවෙනි එක, they will experience gains in production, then they will experience gains in consumption if they trade with each other based on comparative advantage. ඒතර මෙතන කියන්නේ it will definitely happen කියලා නෙමෙයි, the trade will probably take place. Yeah, so that's the answer. And then the fourth one, trade will probably take place but country A will not gain. Then why do they engage in international trade if they don't gain anything? So that's wrong then. මොකද මේකේ මේ first part එකට මේ second part එක set වෙන්නේ නැහැ. If country A doesn't gain anything, they won't engage in international trade. Insa ඒ දෙක set වෙන්නේ නැහැ. Fifth one, trade will probably take place, but country A will be the only one to gain. Then why do this country B engages in international trade? Again, if you look at the two parts of the sentence, ඒ දෙක match වෙන්නේ නැහැ. So wrong. Right, look at this question number 14. Now it says, if the nominal exchange rate between the dollar and the Sri Lankan rupee changes from, we had a similar question in 2011 paper as well, but wait, so let me write $1 in the first situation, $1 equals rupees 110, and in the second situation, $1 equals rupees 135. So the rupee has depreciated. ඒක වාට තේරෙනවා. So වාට මේ ඕන එකකට උත්තර ලියන්න පුළුවන් වෙන්න නම්, so this is the direct quotation system, and let me write the values in indirect quotation system as well. ලියන්න ඕනෙම නැහැ, නිකන් මම ලියනවා. ඒතර අපිට ඕන දෙයකට උත්තර හොයාගන්න පුළුවන්. So rupees 1 equals, so 1 over 110, and in the second case rupees 1 equals 1 over 135. So in the exam you don't need to do this division. දැන් මම ඕක පෙන්නනවා කියලා ඔයා මේක කරන්න ඕනේ නැහැ. මොකද ඔයාට තේරෙනවා. මොකද ඔයාට තේරෙන්නේ? ඔයාට තේරෙන්නේ in the first case you just divide 1 by 110. එතකොට අපි හිතමුකෝ ඔයාට එන්නේ මෙන්න මේ value එක කියලා. ඔයාට එන්නේ මේ value එක. I don't know the value, but just imagine that this is the size of the value. But in the second case, you divide that same one by a higher value. The denominator is greater than the previous denominator. And so what will happen to this? Whatever the value you receive, that will be smaller. knowledge you don't need that exact thing. knowledge but in this case, I can use a calculator and divide this thing. So let me just show you the value. So this will be 0.009, but in the second case, it's 0.007. So as we expected, things have happened. Now come to this question 1. Rupee appreciates, no. Rupee depreciates, and dollar appreciates. So the opposite happens. And then look at this one. Hope you can see this. Sri Lankan goods will become less expensive to Americans. Is it true? It says Sri Lankan goods will become less expensive to Americans. Just imagine that this American imports, again this is Sri Lanka and this is USA. So this American imports goods, and the value of 1 unit of good is just 1 rupee. අපි එහෙම සරලව හිතමු. එක රුපියලක ප්‍රොඩක්ට් එකක් තමයි මේ USA වලින් ඉම්පෝර්ට් කරන්නේ. එතකොට previously they had to pay $0.009 for this product, but now after depreciation of rupee happens, they only need to pay 0.007 rupees. You can see that by looking at these values, and that's why we developed, right? So what has happened? The Sri Lankan product has become less expensive to Americans, so they can now afford the product. It's much more cheaper than in the previous case. Okay, so the first part is correct then. They become less expensive, right? And imports of Sri Lankan goods to US. Okay, anyway, the USA is importing from Sri Lanka. Yes, the imports to US will rise. Yes, because we have a competitive advantage now. Our products are relatively cheaper in America, so that we can export more. If not that we can export more, they will ask more from us because our products are very much cheaper for them. So they will increase the demand, and then we will export more and more. So they will have more and more imports. So both parts are correct in this. Both parts are correct in this second one. The third one, Sri Lankan goods will become more expensive. No, Varadi. Fourth one, Sri Lankan goods will become more expensive. Again, wrong. Sri Lankan goods will become less expensive, yes, to Americans, and imports of Sri Lankan goods to US will fall. Now it's very much cheaper for them, so they will demand more, we will export more, so they will import more. This second part is wrong, but in statement 2 both parts are correct. So the answer for this question 40 is the second one. All right. So look at this question number 41. Under a flexible exchange rate system, all right, the primary mechanism for dealing with temporary disequilibria in balance of payment, all right. Oh, now here it says that there is a mismatch in the balance of payment. The foreign currency receipts is not equal to foreign currency payments. So either we have a deficit or we have a surplus. දෙකෙන් එකක් වෙන්න පුළුවන්. That this mismatch, right? Disequilibrium. එතන we have a mismatch in the balance of payment. එහෙනම් අපි මොකද කරන්නේ? මොකක්ද කරන්න කියලා දහන්නේ? Under flexible exchange rate system, the primary mechanism. Okay, what will happen කියලා අහන්නේ? The rigid system of exchange controls. What? With temporary disequilibria in balance of payment is a rigid system of exchange controls. No. When it comes to this flexible exchange rate system, අපි ඒකට නම කියන්නේ free floating exchange rate system කියලා. It's not rigid. And there are no controls with regard to exchange rate. So this is totally wrong way. Second one, currency flow from surplus to deficit countries. Currency flow වෙන්නේ එහෙම currency flow වෙනවා නෙමෙයි වෙන්නේ, exchange rate will either මම දැනට කියන exchange rate will change. එතකොට මොකද demand එකයි supply එකයි mismatch එකක් තියෙනකොට it will change. මම ඒකට කියන්නේ change කියලා නෙමෙයි වෙන වචනයක්, but we will use it later on. Right, and look at this one. Devaluation or revaluation of exchange. You might think that this is the answer. ඊට පස්සේ යටින් තියෙනවා depreciation or appreciation of foreign exchange rates. Then what is it? Even this can be the answer here. Now you have two answers. And then maintaining a tight fiscal policy, no, that has nothing to do with this flexible exchange rate system, right? When there's a mismatch between the foreign currency supply and the foreign currency demand, based on that foreign currency demand and the foreign currency supply, the exchange rate will change. But how do we recognize that change? How do we recognize that change? Do we really recognize that as devaluation or revaluation? No, these are not the terms we use in free floating exchange rate system. So in free floating exchange rate system, if the exchange rate changes based on the foreign currency demand and supply, we just label that as depreciation or maybe as appreciation of foreign exchange rates. So let me show you that in the relevant theory note, right? The two terms, the way that we use those terms. So this is the fixed exchange rate system. So what are the words we use there? Devaluation. So devaluation, this term comes under fixed foreign exchange rate system. And now look at this one, revaluation, even that comes under the same topic. But if you just check the second one, under free floating foreign exchange rate system, let's say we have the foreign exchange demand, the foreign exchange supply, and based on demand and supply, see what can happen, depreciation or even appreciation can occur. එහෙමයි අපි වචන use කරන්නේ. ඒ නිසා හැම දෙයක්ම කියනකොට සිහියෙන් කියවන්න ඕන මේ consciously. So answer for this question number 41 is a fourth one there. Right, come to this 42. Statistics කරනවා නම් මේවා ප්‍රශ්නවත් වෙන්නේ නැහැ. Anyway, this is very easy. හරි, anyway අපි කියමු මේක. Lawrence curves for country A and country B are shown in the diagram below. So you all should understand stats කළත් නැතත් තේරුම් ගන්න දේ තමයි, this is this 45-degree line, and that 45-degree line we recognize as the equi-distributed line, and this line represents the uniformity of the income distribution. Now for example, right, for example, if you just select 50% of the households, this the equidistributed line represents that 50% of the households should own 50% of the income in the country. But the Lorentz curve represents, but in reality, the first 50% of the population in the country receives somewhere around 15% of the total income. And that's the disparity of the income distribution, which means the gap between this equidistributed line and this Lorentz curve shows you the disparity. And when this gap increases, the disparity increases. That's the meaning. So keeping that meaning in mind, let's read this one. With reference to the above diagram, which of the following statements is correct? So look at this one. Country A has a more equitable distribution of income than country B. See, comparison happens here, right? Again, අපිට කියන්න බෑ that in country A we have a uniform distribution in the income distribution, but compared to this country B, the disparity in income distribution in country A is lower because the gap between the equidistributed line and the Lorentz curve related to this country A is smaller than the gap between the equidistributed line and the Lorentz curve related to this country B. Inisa, yes, this is true, no problem. Second one, country A has less equitable distribution of income. Less equitable, no. More equitable, more uniform, less disparity. So the opposite of this is true. Then Gini coefficient for country A is equal to 1. මෙතන තියෙන එක රටකවත් Gini coefficient is not equal to 1. ඒතකොට ඒ නිසා මේ දෙකම වැරදි. But let me show you how to calculate this Gini coefficient. So let me just take one Lorentz curve and explain this thing. So if I shade this region and label that region as the region X, and if I shade this region and label that as this region Y, how do we calculate this? How do we calculate this Gini coefficient? Gini coefficient is equal to this area X divided by the area X plus Y. Right? Area X divided by the area X plus Y. එතකොට ඔයාලට තේරෙනවා කිසිම රටක මේක 1 වෙන්නේ නැහැ. මේක 1 වෙන නම් මොකද වෙන්න ඕනේ අතරම? මේක 1 වෙන නම් වෙන්න ඕනි condition එක තමයි the Lorentz curve should fall right on the equidistributed line. Lorentz curve should fall right on the equidistributed. Sorry, 1 වෙන නම් එක නෙමෙයි වෙන්න ඕනේ. My mistake. මේක 1 වෙන නම් මොකද වෙන්න ඕනේ? 1 වෙන අමුතු scene එකක් වෙන්න ඕනේ. 1 වෙන නම් the Lorentz curve should take this shape. 1 වෙන නම් Lorentz curve should take this shape. What is the shape? This is the equidistributed line and the Lorentz curve should take this shape. Perfect inequality. What is it? Perfect inequality. Now in this diagram, you don't have two regions as X and Y, you only have the region X. So if you apply the values into Gini coefficient, what will happen? The region X divided by the region X plus the region Y, Y is 0. So the equation will give you X over X and the answer is 1. හැබැයි ඒ තරමට depreciate වෙලා නැහැ. ඒ තරමට මේ රටවල් දෙකෙන් එකක්වත් අවුල් වෙලා නැහැ. It will have a value between 0 and 1. Right? එහෙනම් the Gini coefficient for country A is equal to 1. No, wrong. The Gini coefficient for country B is equal to 1. That is also wrong. අර මම කියවනේ කලින් මේ මෙහෙම සිද්ධියක් මොකද්ද? මම කිව්වා if the Lorentz curve falls right on the equidistributed line, then how much is the value of Gini coefficient? Then this region X becomes, again, the region between, then the region between the Lorentz curve and the equidistributed line becomes 0 because there's no such region now. The reason the Lorentz curve right exactly on the equidistributed line. So there's no this region X, that's 0, that's absent. But the region Y, right? The region Y will be how much? Region Y will be whatever the value. It doesn't matter how much you get there. You just take whatever the value there. then what will happen in this equation? 0 divided by whatever the value, and the answer is 0. So if Gini coefficient is 0, there's no disparity at all. The income distribution is perfectly uniform in that country. Hope you understand those two as well. All right. The fifth one, Gini coefficient for country A is greater than for country B. එතකොට ඔයාලට තේරෙනවා මොකක්ද? Then if this is how we calculate the Gini coefficient when it comes to country A and B, when it comes to both countries, this entire region, the A plus B region has to be, X plus Y region has to be same. ඒක ඔයාලා හැමෝටම තේරෙනවනේ. එතකොට මොකද වෙන්නේ? If I write here, this is this country A and this is this country B. So the denominator of both the equations will be the same amount. Let's assume that to be 100. බොරුවට value එකක් ගන්නෙ. Let's assume that to be 100. Then what happens to this region between equidistributed line and Lorentz curve in country A? That will be somewhat lower than the value you find for country B. මොකද country B වල gap එක වැඩි නිසා that value is greater. Here you have 0.1, here you get 0.2. එතන වෙන්න ඕනේ මේ කියන එකේ opposite. The Gini coefficient for country A has to be lower than that for country B. The answer is the first one. Right, now we will move to this question number 43. GNP per capita measured in US dollars using nominal exchange rate may be a poor indicator of comparative standards of living between high-income countries and low-income countries because of a divergence in which one of the following. All right, so to find the answer for this question, we will have a discussion this way. Just imagine that in USA, right? Imagine that in USA, the GNP per capita is this much. අපි නිකන් හිතමු that in USA, GNP per capita in USA is $5,000. Let's assume that to be just 5,000, right? Is $5,000. And in Sri Lanka, right? So let me write GNP per capita in Sri Lanka. Let's assume this to be rupees 600,000. Just a hypothetical value, right? Let's assume this to be rupees 600,000. Now you can't make comparisons by using two different values that have two different units of measurements. Now you need to get these two values under a same unit of measurement. Let me convert this GNP per capita in Sri Lanka into, let's say, in terms of dollars. And when I make this conversion, let's see what happens. This is the most important part, right? When I make this conversion, I use the nominal exchange rate. So let's assume this nominal exchange rate to be $1 equals, let's say, $1 equals rupees 300. Let's assume so. Right. So how do I convert this thing now? I take rupees 600,000. Then I divide it by the nominal exchange rate, which means rupees 300. And then I get that value in dollars. So in dollars, I get here 2,000. Now I can make comparisons. See the two values that I'm going to compare. I'm comparing GNP per capita in USA, which is 5,000. I'm comparing that with again GNP per capita in Sri Lanka in terms of dollars, and that gives me 2000. So by looking at these two values, we can understand how poor we are. Because in America, it's just 5,000 per person, but in Sri Lanka, it's just 2,000 per person. So this way we can make comparisons. But the problem, when I convert this rupees 600,000, the per capita in Sri Lanka in rupees, when I convert that into dollar amount, I use the nominal exchange rate. And this is the comparison that happens now. All right, so this is this first situation. So let me draw this line here. This is about the first situation. Right, now look at the question once again. GNP per capita measured in US dollars using nominal exchange rate may be a poor indicator of comparative standards of living between high-income countries and low-income countries. See that now. The question says that we may have a problem in this comparison because this is a high-income country and this is a low-income country. So when you evaluate the GNP per capita based on the nominal exchange rates, the question says that it may be a poor indicator. But why is that? That's the question, right? Why is that? එතකොට ඔයා මේකේ answers ටික බැලුවොත් මේකේ ඉතුරු ටික බැලුවොත් එම ඒකේ කියනවා මෙන්න මෙහෙම කතාවක්. මොකක්ද ඒකේ කියන කතාව? This will be a poor comparison, right? This will be a poor comparison because of a divergence, because of the difference in, let's say the first one, because of the difference in nominal exchange rates from the purchasing power parity exchange rates. Now, the problem, you can't recognize whether this is a correct answer or the wrong answer if you don't know how to calculate this purchasing power parity exchange rates. So let me calculate that and show you what happens. So here in this example, I have taken the nominal exchange rate to be, look at this one, I have taken that to be $1 equals rupees 300. So let me show you the note related to this. So look at this. It says purchasing power parity exchange rate. The purchasing power parity exchange rate is the ratio, that's a ratio of the values of a certain basket of goods when measured in the domestic currency units of the two different countries. So for example, if you don't get this, right, දැන් මෙතන මේ වචන ටිකක් තියෙනවා මොකද්ද? මොනවද තියෙන වචන? The purchasing power parity exchange rate is the ratio of the values of a certain basket of goods. Simply, if you learn statistics or if you do statistics, you should know the meaning of this thing. When I say certain basket of goods, it simply stands for this, a sample of goods. Out of the billions of goods and services in the economy, we just select a sample. We just select few goods. Basket of goods කියලා කියන්නේ few goods කියලා, right? Selected sample of goods when measured in domestic currency units of two different countries. හරි, basket of goods, sample of goods, that's in plural නේ. හරි, ඒක දැනට අපි අමතක කරමු. Just assume that one good we consume this good in Sri Lanka and then again in USA. අපි එහෙම මොකක් හරි good එකක් ගමු. අපි තුන් pizza, burger ඕන තරම් තියෙනවනේ. ඒ නිසා දැන් අපි ගමු, forget about the basket of goods, we consider only this good. So let me write, in Sri Lanka, let's say a burger, let's say one burger equals rupees, how much, I don't know, let's put a value here, rupees 600. 600 burger, but for the time being. And in USA, let's say one burger equals, let's say $3. අපි එහෙම ගමුකෝ $3. Right. Then if you go back to the definition of purchasing power parity exchange rate, මොකද කියන්නේ? The purchasing power parity exchange rate is the ratio of the values of one good when measured in the domestic currency units of two different countries. It's this ratio between this 600 and 3. ඒ කියන්නේ මම දැන් ලියනවා the purchasing power parity exchange rate is, right, the purchasing power parity exchange rate is dollars $3 equals rupees 600, so that it simply gives us this value $1 equals rupees 200. So this is the purchasing power parity exchange rate. When you make the products equal, right? When you make the products equal, this is the amount that you spend in USA and this is the amount you spend in Sri Lanka to purchase those goods. And that we recognize as the purchasing power parity exchange rate. So let me highlight that. So this is the purchasing power parity exchange rate. And here you see, right? Here you see the nominal exchange rate. What if you try to compare this GNP per capita in USA with GNP per capita in Sri Lanka in terms of dollars, but this time you use this purchasing power parity exchange rate to make the conversion. එහෙනම් අපි දැන් බලමු. So we still have this value as a value related to this USA market. So GNP per capita in USA. This is the third part of the discussion. Right. So GNP per capita in USA is $5,000 and GNP per capita in Sri Lanka in rupees is 600,000. And now let me calculate this GNP per capita in Sri Lanka in terms of dollars. But this time when I do this conversion, what do I use? Let me write here, I use purchasing power parity exchange rate that I calculated earlier, and that rate is $1 equals rupees 200. So that's the rate. You know, I take rupees 600,000, and that I divide this time by rupees 200, and the answer I receive is dollars. How much? 3,000. So this is the value I received now. Now this time I make the comparison, right? This time I make the comparison between this 5,000 and then this 3,000. But earlier I made the comparison between this 5,000 and then this 2,000. So if you just compare these two values, mama kiwa me, you see how poor we are. If you look at these two values, එච්චරමක් poor නෑ කියලා හිතෙනවා. මොකද the gap is very much lower. Right? The gap is very much lower. එතකොට දැන් ගානේ කියන්නේ මොකද්ද? ගානේ කියනවා that this comparison is poor, it's misleading, but this comparison is somewhat good. දැන් ඕක good කියලා කියන theory එක අපි මුලින් බැලුවොත් එහෙම දැන් අපි බැලුවොත් එහෙම to compare the GNP per capita in two different countries, which exchange rate is the best exchange rate? Is it the nominal exchange rate or the purchasing power parity exchange rate? What ඒක බලා ගන්න ඕන. Just look at the importance of purchasing power parity exchange rate. ඒක කියනවා it compares the relative cost of standard set of goods and services between two countries, and you know the meaning of that now. And then it says it can be used for meaningful comparisons of economic indicators like GDP and even standard of living. GNP per capita කියන CN. So it's meaningful to use the purchasing power parity exchange rate. Right? It's meaningful to use the purchasing power parity exchange rate when comparing GDP values or maybe when comparing standard of living between two countries. AI කියන එකට උත්තරේ මෙන්න මෙතන තියෙනවා. This nominal exchange rate can differ. The nominal exchange rate is somewhat higher. In this case, the nominal exchange rate is somewhat higher than the purchasing power parity exchange rate. Itara මේක relatively lower, but the other value is relatively higher. itara මේ value එක මේ rate එක higher වෙන්න GNP per capita in Sri Lanka in terms of dollars ඒක අඩු වෙනවා. හැබැයි එතන ප්‍රශ්නේ තියෙන්නේ මෙන්න මේකයි. ප්‍රශ්නේ තියෙන්නේ මේ exchange rates වල changes නිසා right exchange rates වල changes නිසා මේ comparison එක වෙනස් වෙනවා. මේ වෙනසට හේතුව මොකද්ද? The difference between nominal exchange rate and the purchasing power parity exchange rate. So that's the reason for this difference. එහෙනම් ඔය ඔක්කොම ඔළුවේ තියාගෙන come to this discussion. Question number 43. GNP per capita measured in US dollars using nominal exchange rate may be a poor indicator of comparative standard of living between high income countries and low income countries because of a difference in what? Now you saw difference in nominal exchange rate and the purchasing power parity exchange rate. So this is the best one to apply in such situations, and this is not so suitable. ඊළඟ අනිත් ඒවා අපි බැලුවොත් එහෙම because of a difference in population growth rate. එතකොට it matters when it comes to this per capita thing. හැබැයි මෙතන more than that per capita we are going to make a comparison between GNP per capita with high income country with another low income country. එතකොට more than the population growth rate the exchange rate matters. ඊළඟ third one says rates of price and wage inflation. Rate of price and wage inflation may affect to the domestic price levels in the considering country. හැබැයි compare කරනකොට ඒක ඉච්ච ලොකු ප්‍රශ්නයක් වෙන්නේ නැහැ. මොකද අපි එකම goods baskets දෙක තමයි අරගෙන තියෙන්නේ when calculating this purchasing power parity exchange rate. The fourth one, ratio of imports to national income. No. And the fifth one, nominal effective exchange rates. එතකොට මොකද්ද? Because of a difference in nominal effective exchange rate. No. The answer has to be the first one. Question 43, first one is the answer. Right, now come to this question 44. Long-term economic growth in a country would be encouraged through which of the following combinations of events? එහෙනම් long-term economic growth එකක් වෙන්න නම් මොකද්ද වෙන්න ඕනි? Aggregate demand should go up and then the production should go up. Even the employment level should go up, income should go up. ඔය ටික තමයි වෙන්න ඕනේ. එතන economic growth එක බලනවා more than everything we just need to look at this the real growth in the production. හරි එහෙනම් which one of the following situations will encourage this long term economic growth? Savings rate high. Okay, if savings are high, yes, you have more than enough money to make investments. So obviously, investments will be high. Investments will be high. But once again, if interest rates are high, then that will affect to this aggregate demand. It will make this aggregate demand lower if interest rates are high. ඒ නිසා පොඩි ප්‍රශ්නයක් තියෙනවා. මේ දෙක හරි, but interest rates high කියලා කිව්වොත් මොකද්ද වෙන්නේ? The money supply will decrease. When the money supply decreases, aggregate demand decreases. When aggregate demand decreases, production decreases. එතකොට economic growth doesn't happen. Alright, the second one. In the second one, it says, for having this long run economic growth, the savings, the rate of savings must be very high, yes, because then we have more than enough money to make investments. So obviously, if savings are high, investments will be high. Investment expenditure, if that is high, see aggregate demand equals consumption IG and then NX. So if investment is high, it will anyway increase the aggregate demand. And on the other side, interest rates are low. When interest rates are lower, it will further encourage investments and it will further encourage consumption. Then aggregate demand will further increase. Then the production will increase, employment levels will increase, this will increase so that the economic growth is ensured. So the answer for this 44 is the second one. Right. එතකොට දැන් මේ වගේව පිළිගන්න බෑ. මොකද savings rate එක high නම් investment rate එක low වෙන්න බෑ. It has to be high for having this economic growth. එතකොට අනිත් ඒවා ටික we can simply ignore. Right, 45. So how do we calculate this labor force participation rate? එහෙනම් බලමු. We have the population that's 60. Population in working age, that's 50, number in the labor force, that's 30, number employed is 28, number unemployed is 2. By giving these values, what do they ask us to calculate? The labor force participation rate in the economy. Right, and this is how we calculate that labor force participation rate. Labor force participation rate is equal to, the equation is labor force over, we write working age population. Working age population multiplied by 100. So if you look at the given values, this is very straightforward question. Labor force is given to us as 30 and the working age population is given to us as 50. අර දීලා තියෙන අනිත් values වැඩක් නැහැ. So that you can multiply this division by 100 and the answer will be 60%, and that's the answer. So third one is the answer for this question number 45. Right, very straightforward. So come to this question number 46. In question 46, it says economic growth is usually measured by the annual change in. So it is measured from the annual change of what? Do you remember that? So there are two alternative methods to measure economic growth. The first one is through economic growth rate, if not through calculating increase in the real GDP. The other one is through calculating the increase in the per capita real GDP. So one of these. Now, if you come to this, you have it here. Real gross national product, GNP. By calculating real GNP, you can evaluate the economic growth. එතර මේ අනිත් ඒවා කතා කරලා තේරුමක් නැහැ. මොකද කිසිම meaning එකක් නැති නිසා. Question 47. The dependency ratio in Sri Lanka is defined as. Right. How do we calculate this dependency ratio? We actually calculate two dependency ratios. එතර එකක් තමයි child dependency ratio. The other one is old age dependency ratio. So if you just write this, the equation of calculating child dependency ratio, that is, in the denominator we use working age population, right? Working age population, and on the top you write population from 0 to 40, නැත්නම් population under 14 years. And if you calculate this, the other one, old age dependency ratio, so there you put population over 60 years divided by, again, working age population. So both you need to multiply by 100. So this is how you calculate them. Enough. Let's come to this. The dependency ratio in Sri Lanka is defined as the number of children to adults in the population. No. Percentage of unemployed. No. We don't consider whether they are unemployed or employed. Non-working age population to working age population. 100% true. Then here, if you get the total of the population under 14 years and the population over 16 years, simply you can just recognize that as a non-working age population. So what do you do when calculating this? You take that non-working age population, you divide it by the working age population, and you multiply by 100. So answer has to be the third one. So no point of reading the other ones. Those are easy. All right, look at this question number 48. One of the components of Human Development Index. Right, the first one, the percentage of population who have completed 12 years of schooling. Second one, average daily intake of protein, life expectancy at birth, adult literacy rate. The fifth one, the number of doctors per 1,000 persons in the population. Obviously, so let's look at the note related to this, then you can understand the component. So these are the components. Again, we have the criteria and how do we evaluate this, and these are the components. So the life expectancy at birth, expected schooling, the years of schooling, the mean years of schooling, and the purchasing power parity GNI per capita. So out of all these provided answers, we find that component here, the third one, 48, the third one. Life expectancy at birth. And ඒකම තමයි අර පළවෙනියට තිබුණේ. හරි ඊළඟට මේක් questions එක මම ඩිස්කස් කරන්නේ මොකද හේතුව මේවා annually update වෙන දේවල්. So you can just refer the note and recognize the answers directly. And that's all with regard to this 2012 MCQ paper.